Welcome back to another Pirkei Avot text discussion. I'm Rabbi Drew. This is the seventh text we are discussing in the second chapter of Pirkei Avot. It starts off by saying, he used to say. He being Hillel, as we've seen in the last few texts in the second chapter. We are talking about Hillel, the first century sage who lived during the Second Temple times. Also, if you remember from the Passover Seder, the Passover Haggadah, we have a Hillel sandwich. It says this is what Hillel used to do while the temple was still standing, and he would make his sandwich. So this is the same Hillel. Now in this statement, I told you, I informed you that it starts off by saying he used to say. So that is this is a common statement, a common piece of wisdom that he used to dispense. This one is lengthy. I mentioned yesterday's interesting text involving Hillel, which was rather short. This is actually unusually long. It starts off with 5 different things. The more flesh, the more worms. The more property, the more anxiety. The more wives, the more witchcraft. The more female slaves, the more lewdness. The more slaves, the more robbery. Obviously, not something that's necessarily politically correct for our times with the anxieties around the women aspects. Although the more property, the more anxiety, I think that's something with which people can easily understand. The more money one might have, the more concerns, the more problems, the more worries. Interestingly, the one he opens up with is the more flesh, the more worms, which I don't know that anybody would necessarily think about how their body necessarily decomposes, but I think that that's what he's going for, is when your corpse is in the ground and how it's decomposing, that it would have more worms. Okay, it's an interesting one, but the more property, the more anxiety. It's certainly something within one's own world. The more wives, the more witchcraft, the more female slaves, the more lewdness. Okay, so concern clearly around women, anxieties to be sure, and the more slaves, the more robbery. If you have male slaves, then there's more risk for your property being stolen. Okay, interesting. Obviously, a lot of concerns around that. But it's not all negative. He starts off with those 5 negative statements, but he has 4 encouraging statements. The more Torah, the more life. The more sitting, the more wisdom. The more counsel, the more understanding. The more charity, the more peace. There are, as he pointed out at the outset, there are definitely things that when we increase them, there are many worries that come along, concerns, potential pitfalls. But when we have engaged in positive activities, then we can have positive outcomes, right? Marbe, he talks about Marbe Torah. One increases in Torah, study of Torah, teaching Torah. You get more life out of that. Interesting. One wouldn't necessarily associate more Torah with more life, maybe more wisdom, maybe something better. But Hillel, right here says one gets more life. Marbe Yeshiva, Marbe Chochma. I think why sitting, that's a little unclear. Maybe one's sitting and contemplating, maybe one's sitting and studying. It's unclear what the sitting, how that necessarily leads to more wisdom. Marba Eitza, Marba Tuvuna, right? The more counsel, the more understanding. When you're taking counsel or you're involved in some sort of counseling session, maybe you gain some more understanding. Marba Tzedakah, Marba Shalom. The more charity, the more peace. Really interesting insight. I think it's, it's interesting contrasting with the earlier, at the outset of when you have a lot, you're concerned what will happen to it. But here he says, when you give charity, when you give tzedakah, it gives you peace. It's not just what happens to it. You feel, I think he's saying there's a sense of good feeling about you, that you feel good that you're giving this charity, you're giving this tzedakah. And then he goes in a different direction. So you have those 5 statements about when you increase certain things, you increase anxieties and concerns and worries. And then he has those 4, which when you do more of these activities, you gain these various characteristics, various aspects that there's positive to gain in this world through those things. Now he closes off with a couple of lines. If one acquires a good name, he has acquired something for himself. If one inquires for himself knowledge of Torah, he has acquired life in the world to come. So let's go back to this. If one acquires Shem Tov, a good name, then you've got something for yourself. It's for you. You acquired a good name, another term for a good name is a good reputation, right? If you gain a good reputation, that's good for you. That's what he's saying. Great, you got that for yourself. But if you acquire words of Torah, he's definitely, he wants to hammer home that Torah is good. And now here, if you acquire words of Torah for you, you've acquired life in the world to come. World to come is a good thing. It's not just about this world, he is saying. It's also about the world to come. That spending time on Torah is good for the world to come. So he advocates, and we've seen this in the last few texts of his, that he's really advocating wisdom. We saw this in, where do we see this? Okay. He said, an ignorant person, a timid person cannot learn, and nor can an impatient person teach. Also, someone who engages too much in business will not become wise. The words he uses there, and this was 2 texts ago in the 5th text in the 2nd chapter, he said, V'lo kol hamarba bischora machkim. That people who are so engaged in business, so engaged in commercial enterprises, are not going to become wise, which is interesting because here he advises how do you get wise? Through yeshiva, through sitting, through contemplation. But if you're engaged in commercial enterprises all the time, how can you gain wisdom? Interesting. And obviously we've seen here not once but twice he's advocating Torah study. So, and not just advocating Torah study, but it gives one life. And it gives one life not only in this world, but also for the world to come. All right. Thank you so much. As we'll see tomorrow, as we'll see in the next, as we'll see in the text to come, that we're going to switch and transition away from Hillel. And I had mentioned, for some context, we had seen in this first chapter pairs passing off something to another set of pairs. And then it sort of paused after Hillel and Shammai. So, and then we went back in this chapter to Hillel, some more set of wisdom advice, several pieces of wisdom, in fact, from Hillel. And this was the final one before we transition back tomorrow or the next video, as we transition back as they hand off whatever it is, maybe a mantle of leadership, as they pass it off to Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. All right. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.